When you think about making big changes in society, sometimes it seems like focusing on one specific group is the key.
Right, like that example of the Natural Foot Society in China.
Exactly. They targeted officials, commercial families, and bam, foot binding starts to end.
But then you contrast that with, say, the idea of focusing on the depressed castes in India, hoping their uplift sparks wider change.
So it kind of makes you wonder, right? Is there some magic formula, a certain type of group you reach, and everything else follows?
It's a great question. And looking back at history, well, it gives us some really interesting perspectives on this.
Which is what we're doing today. We're diving deep into how the Apostle Paul went about setting up early Christian communities.
Specifically in 4 Roman provinces.
And our sources really get into this question. Was he deliberately targeting a specific class, or was it something else?
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We'll unpack some common theories about Paul's strategy.
Look at who his early followers actually were.
And then, see if his approach offers any lessons for how social movements, even today, actually get going.
Okay, so let's get into it. One big idea, which our source tackles, is this special class theory.
Right. The idea that Paul's success hinged on finding a particular group in those places who were just, uniquely open to what he was saying.
Maybe because of their beliefs already or the social position, something like that.
Exactly. That kind of thinking.
But the source we're looking at kind of pushes back on that.
It does. It highlights that Paul's first move, generally, was to go into the synagogues.
Okay.
He was preaching to Jewish people, yes, but also to Greeks who were already associated with the synagogue, the God-fearers.
So not some secret ready-made audience, but established religious groups.
Pretty much. And it's fascinating how that initial strategy actually played out.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing with the Jewish communities, was it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
The source lays it out. Paul starts preaching, maybe gets a bit of interest. But then opposition builds up. People start accusing him of blasphemy.
And eventually he gets kicked out.
Right. There's that moment in Acts chapter 18 where he basically says, okay, if you won't listen, I'm turning to the Gentiles.
That feels like a major turning point.
It really is. And it tells you something important, right?
Yeah.
That initial plan, targeting the synagogue audience, didn't fully work out as maybe intended.
So he had to adapt.
He did. And the result, according to the source, is that these early churches in those provinces ended up being overwhelmingly made up of Greek converts.
Yeah, the book of Acts, Luke's writing, it really draws that contrast. Jewish resistance on one hand, Greek eagerness on the other.
And Paul himself, in his letters, refers to his converts having come out of idol worship.
So most weren't from that initial synagogue crowd.
It seems not the majority, no. Which then leads to the question, well, how important were those few Jewish converts and God-fearing Greeks who did join him?
Good question. Did they bring something crucial even if they were small in number?
The source says yes, absolutely. They provided a vital foundation.
Like what sort of things?
Well, think about it. They already believed in one God, rejected idolatry.
Okay, that's big.
Right? They understood morality as part of religion. They were used to public worship. And crucially, they knew the Old Testament scriptures.
So Paul could build on that existing knowledge.
Precisely. And he did. He'd use the Old Testament, sometimes in allegorical ways, finding deeper meanings.
Yeah.
Like with the story of Hagar and Sarah.
Interesting.
To explain his message, he talked about circumcision not just being physical, but a matter of the heart. He framed Abraham as the father of all who have faith, not just Jews.
So he's bridging their world to his message. Makes sense.
It does. But, and this is important, the source also warns against making too much of this group's influence.
Why is that?
Because Paul himself seems clear that the bulk of his converts came from a pagan background, former idolaters. You look at his letters to the churches in Macedonia, for example. They don't assume much Old Testament knowledge. They deal with common issues found in the wider pagan society.
So those initial converts were important, maybe foundational, but not the whole story of the growth.
Exactly. They were a starting point, perhaps a crucial one, but the movement quickly expanded beyond them. And understanding the challenges Paul faced, especially from the Jewish opposition, really drives this home.
Oh yeah, the source really emphasizes how intense that opposition was.
It wasn't just disagreements. We're talking physical violence against Paul and his team, people actively trying to disrupt his work.
Undermining his authority, questioning his message constantly.
Absolutely. And think about the impact that would have. Paul lists his hardships in 2 Corinthians: beatings, imprisonment, shipwrecks, danger everywhere.
Yeah, it's a heavy list.
For someone considering his message, seeing the leader facing that much trouble, especially from his own people,
Yeah.
well, it could look like a strong argument against him, couldn't it?
Definitely a stumbling block, as the source calls it. Like, if
Yeah.
this is true, why is it causing so much chaos and rejection?
And apparently it got even worse when Jewish leaders saw people from the synagogue actually leaving to follow Paul.
Jealousy and fear kicking in.
Seems like it. Acts mentions envy being a major motivator for the opposition.
Which kind of explains why Paul eventually started preaching next door to the synagogue in Corinth, right? In Titus Justus's house.
Yes, the source suggests that move might have been quite deliberate, a way to physically mark out a distinction.
To say, okay, this is separate. This isn't just another faction within Judaism.
Possibly.
Yeah.
A calculated separation, perhaps forced upon him by the conflict.
Okay, so he faced huge hurdles with his initial target audience. But what about beyond the synagogue? Did he then focus on, say, the poorest or most marginalized?
That's another interesting point the source makes. It argues, no, he didn't seem to exclusively target any specific lower-class group.
So not just rounding up the loafers or the dock workers or whatever.
Doesn't look like it. Yeah. And the image of him just preaching on street corners to whoever drifts by, that might be overstated too.
Really? Because you kind of picture that.
Well, the source points to incidents like the lame man at Lystra or the soothsaying girl in Philippi.
Right, I remember those stories.
But it argues these weren't necessarily planned street sermons. The girl in Philippi, for instance, she just started following them around, shouting things unsolicited.
Okay, so not a deliberate street preaching strategy in those cases.
Maybe not primarily. What Luke does emphasize consistently in Acts is where Paul taught.
You mentioned some places earlier.
Yeah, Lydia's house, Jason's house, that house next to the synagogue, the school of Tyrannus in Ephesus.
Those sound more like established places, maybe more respectable settings than just a random street corner.
That seems to be the implication. Perhaps showing an understanding that you need a stable base, a reputable location for a community to form.
Interesting. And just as he wasn't solely focused on the lowest classes, he also wasn't targeting the elites.
Apparently not intentionally. Not the scholars, the philosophers, the high officials.
Didn't he try that in Athens with the philosophers on the Areopagus?
He did, and the source notes that his experience there might have actually led him to consciously adopt a different approach later in Corinth, focusing less on philosophical debate and more on the core message.
Okay, so if he wasn't specifically targeting the very bottom or the very top, who were the converts? What was the makeup of these early churches?
Well, the source brings in scholars like Bishop Lightfoot and Professor Ramsey. Their analysis suggests that the churches drew heavily from, let's say, the middle and lower classes.
People who worked, maybe had some basic education.
Exactly. People where education and work go hand in hand, as Ramsey put it. The source also mentions the poverty of the Macedonian churches as evidence.
And didn't it mention noble women or honorable women in some places?
It does, which is interesting. It might suggest that maybe fewer men of high rank were initially joining compared to women of similar status.
Huh. And slavery. That was widespread then.
Very much so. And the letters frequently address issues related to masters and slaves, which strongly suggests a significant number of converts came from among the enslaved population.
So a real mix, but maybe centered on working people, artisans, freedmen, slaves, some middle-class folks, some women of standing.
That seems to be the picture. A diverse group, certainly not limited to one narrow band of society.
And the source admits he probably attracted some less stable types too, right?
Oh, almost certainly. You know, people drawn to anything new, maybe hoping for miracles or power, like those sons of Sceva mentioned in Acts who tried to use Jesus' name without really following him.
Any new movement gets those hangers on.
Exactly. But the key insight, the source argues, is that Paul seemed to understand you needed more than that. You needed a core.
A foundation.
Yeah, a foundation of reasonably respectable, religiously inclined people. People who could provide leadership, stability, and prevent the whole thing from just fizzling out or going completely off the rails.
That makes a lot of sense. You need structure, you need reliable people.
So wrapping up Paul's method, it doesn't look like this meticulous targeting of one specific class, high or low.
It sounds more like he preached widely to whoever would listen.
Pretty much. The source compares it to experiences in the East even today, where you might find people from all sorts of backgrounds engaging with a speaker or a new idea in a public or semi-public space.
So the secret to his success wasn't necessarily finding a pre-existing special class or just relying on the synagogue network.
The source argues no.
Hmm.
because, modern missions have sometimes had access to synagogues or former proselytes, but haven't always seen the same kind of explosive growth. The key seems to lie elsewhere.
Which raises that other question the source tackles. Does this approach only work in so-called civilized societies?
Right, the objection that maybe Paul's methods wouldn't translate to, say, tribal groups or populations without that Greco-Roman background.
What does the source say to that?
Well, it kind of challenges the premise. It suggests maybe the real issue isn't the population, but whether Paul's full approach has been consistently tried.
Implying we shouldn't underestimate the potential impact.
Exactly. And it offers counterexamples. Places like the South Seas, Papua, New Zealand, parts of Africa, even among the lower castes in India.
Where introducing the Christian message led to really significant changes.
Yes. Development of education, local leadership emerging, major social shifts. Transformations that suggest the message itself has power across different cultural contexts.
So the failure isn't inherent in the people, maybe it's in how the approach is applied. Or maybe not applying the whole approach Paul used.
That seems to be the concluding thought from the source. That perhaps a lack of similar results stems more from not fully embracing Paul's broader strategy, the open proclamation, the community building, the resilience, rather than the nature of the people themselves.
Okay, so bringing this all together for our listeners, the big takeaway here seems to be that Paul's remarkable success wasn't really about some clever marketing strategy targeting one perfect demographic.
No, it seems much broader, more organic than that.
He preached openly, built communities with diverse people, focused on creating a stable core, and crucially, persevered through intense opposition.
Right. It wasn't about finding the right class, but building a resilient community wherever people were willing to listen and commit.
And that leaves us with a really interesting thought, doesn't it? If Paul's success wasn't primarily driven by targeting a specific influential class, what does that tell us about efforts for social change today? Are we sometimes too focused on finding that magic key group?
It's a great question to ponder. What are the most crucial elements? Is it the message? Is it the way you build community? Is it just sheer persistence against the odds?
Or maybe that organic growth, letting it take root across different parts of society. What part of Paul's story, as we've discussed it, stands out most to you listening? Something to think about.